What about his approach to, I don't know, economics? I think that one of the things we've seen about the tariffs is they didn't wield the gross explosion in the markets that we expected, but neither have they greatly benefited America either. It seems to be a bit of a nothing burger, if anything, a slow burner. Do you think that Trump's approach to the geoeconomics of this, as you mentioned with semiconductors and core minerals, could be the difference?
I think the tariffs have accomplished some things. They have risen prices, no question about that. I think the administration is actually right that they're not really contributing to systemic inflation because, by definition, tariffs are a one-time price increase, right? They're not sustaining sort of flywheel of price increases. So even Secretary Besson says, yes, prices have risen, but they're not going to continue to rise because we're not increasing tariffs continuously, right? It was sort of a one-done mostly type of situation.
This is The Global Gambit.
How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to The Global Gambit, a podcast that looks at the intersection of geopolitics, international relations, and economic statecraft, with a particular emphasis often on the Russia-Ukraine war, but as always, branching out into the areas of great power politics, international grand strategy, and just a lot of different aspects to do with economics as well. And that's sort of what I want to do in this first of two halves, which is look at the relationship of sort of the geoeconomics and the geopolitics from the perspective of the United States. A couple of weeks ago, I released a video about the US's new national security strategy, which is a very important document that each head of state or POTUS produces, demonstrating how they sort of effectively see the world or their strategic visions and priorities for their administration. And Trump's one, it was pretty interesting, I guess you could say, but namely that it didn't criticize North Korea, it didn't really criticize Russia. Actually, North Korea wasn't mentioned. In the spotlight of Trump's criticisms was Europe, that they are facing civilization erasure. Now, I'm sure some of you have watched my video or seen plenty of coverage, but that's what I wanted to cover in part one with a returning guest, Dmitri Alperovitch, who is the chairman of Silverado Policy Accelerator and an all-round, I think, great expert on security, cyber areas, international relations, and geopolitics more broadly. And Dmitri, I think just getting started in this sort of first of two halves, what do you make of the NSS? I want to come to Taiwan and Trump's revelations just yesterday in that weird address he gave to the US people. What were your takeaways from the document?
Well, thanks for having me on. It's great to be back on the show. Look, I actually disagree with your characterization that this document is a very important document. I don't think it's ever actually an important document. At most, it may be, during other presidencies, a characterization of the current worldview of the administration, which may change as the events unfold. Who here remembers the Biden NSS or the Obama NSS? These are not the documents that sort of mark some sort of historic turning point in foreign policy of the United States. And I think actually this document in particular is even less relevant than these largely irrelevant documents of prior administration, because I actually don't think it represents the president's view. I think it's been written by various constituencies within the administration that are ideological on these issues, and this president is anything but ideological. So the three big themes you could say in this NSS are the sort of trolling of Europe on the civilization collapse, as you say, the Western Hemisphere dominance theme, and then the containment of China theme. And I don't think actually Donald Trump cares much about any of these issues. I don't think he cares about European civilization collapse. In fact, he's quite a big fan of Europe. He likes to visit the United Kingdom and his golf properties there, and was a big fan of the Queen. He likes the pomp and circumstance and the history of Europe. He's palling around with Macron. I've been told that they text regularly. He loved the Bastille Day celebrations there. He couldn't care less about the AfD and other sort of right-wing parties that are emerging across the continent. That's not his issue at all. I think it's a J.D. Vance issue, but it's not a Donald Trump issue. The Western Hemisphere is also, I don't think, a particularly big obsession of his. Imagine the situation where President Xi calls President Trump and says, I'm thinking about an investment project in, I don't know, let's say Panama, where I'm going to put up money to finance a port facility, and I'm going to give you 50% of the equity. Do you think Donald Trump says, absolutely not, stay out of the Western Hemisphere? I think he would embrace that and say, let's go into business together. So I don't think that he cares much about the Monroe Doctrine and that ideological component of the NSS strategy. And then I don't think he cares much about containing China. In fact, he says Xi Jinping is a good friend of his, a great leader of China. So everything in that document around containing China within the first island chain is a representation of some people in the administration that are very hawkish on China. In fact, arguably, this is the most hawkish cabinet that we've ever had on China, but I don't actually think it represents the president's views. So, and this president, as we all know, after watching him for so many years, does not get boxed in by any ideology, any strategy. So this document, even less so than most of the others, is, I think, should not be taken as a representation of what this administration is going to do in the future on any one of these areas.
Interesting. This is why I enjoy conversing with you, Dmitri, because you're straight in. No, I disagree. And I agree with you to a point that I think that there's a degree of reflection. This is more about how J.D. Vance. I had a conversation with the Financial Times' Martin Wolf on this, and he was saying that it's more of a reflection of sort of where MAGA wants to go after Trump, right? There's a lot of hysteria around who takes over the movement. Is it J.D. Vance? What about the infighting between Trump and Marjorie Taylor Greene? And that's so. Do you not think that there is any reflection of the NSS in Trump at all? It's more about his, I don't know, posse and those around him and what they want to do.
Yeah, I'm quite convinced that the president has not read this document. I mean, he's not a fan of reading 30-page documents. So no, I don't think it's a strategy at all. Now, if I guess you were to glean any insights from the strategy and you were to assume that J.D. Vance would be president in 2028, then yeah, I think it's a pretty good reflection of the J.D. Vance's view of the world, with some exceptions. I actually don't think that J.D. Vance is a huge hawk on China. So all that containment of China, I don't think that is necessarily his view. I'm not even sure that he's a kind of big fan of the Monroe Doctrine and of fighting wars with Venezuela. But certainly on the European civilization collapse, that is his issue. That's what he sort of opened up with in his speech in Munich last year, and probably will do so again next year in Munich. So yeah, there are elements of J.D. Vance there, but not exclusively. I think there's a strong footprint of Marco Rubio. I think he cares deeply about the Western Hemisphere and the Venezuela issue, and many others, including Marco, that are hawkish on China within the administration. I think put in the China containment pieces in there.
Yeah, I was going to say that, ironically, there was very little mention of Taiwan. I think the American administration had sort of emphasized that it was basically continuation of what had preceded. But with this new huge support package, or however you want to frame it, that shows a sign that sort of the Trump administration does still prioritize Asia. Or let me reframe the question. If you don't think that the NSS is any reflection of what Trump's strategic vision or policy objectives are, what is then? Is it about the Western Hemisphere, or is it about taking on China or counterbalancing, or is it just about Team Trump and whatever he feels that day?
Well, I actually disagree with you. I think there's quite a bit on Taiwan, and more than you've seen from traditional national security strategies in there. It talks about the importance of Taiwan in terms of semiconductor production, the importance of Taiwan because of the direct access to the second island chain. So there's quite a bit of stuff in there that you have not seen previous administrations discussed so directly. Now, there was one change in wording that, sort of the close readers of China policy, Taiwan policy have noticed with some concern, which is that the traditional policy of ambiguity with regards to China, Taiwan, and cross-strait relations is that the United States would oppose any change in the status quo, right? Essentially code word for any forceful unification between mainland and Taiwan. And the change in the NSS was that we will not support the change in the status quo. So quite a bit of a sort of watering down of the position. Unclear if that's intentional or if someone was just sloppy with the wording there, but certainly there's some concern in Taiwan about that. But again, as I mentioned, we should never read too much into these things. Policy does not get decided by saying, in the Situation Room, let's go back to the NSS and see what it said and guide our view on the decision making. That's just not how things ever work, and things get decided in the moment based on the situation as it unfolds. So it's a reflection of the view of some in the administration. I'm sure some will argue for certain positions based on what you see in the NSS, but ultimately it's President Trump's administration, and he will decide, as he always does, what he wants to do on any particular issue.
But Dmitri, in and of itself, do you not think there's a little bit of a problem here, which is that if Trump or whoever it is writing is being as heavily critical of the Europeans as they are. And yet they want to, I don't know, approach Taiwan in a certain way, which will require allies and partners to be a part of that. Isn't that going to be detrimental?
No, and look, I actually don't think that any administration in recent years, whether it's the Biden administration or the Trump administration, really thought that Europe would contribute much, if anything, on the Taiwan issue. In fact, the opposite has been the case where both the Trump administration and the Biden administration before that were telling the Europeans, look, why don't you stay out of the Indo-Pacific? We are the Indo-Pacific power. We've got allies like Japan and Australia there. What we need you to do is take care of your own backyard and Russia, because we might not be able to do so if we're engaged with China. But we don't need Germany to send one frigate over to pass through to the Taiwan Strait. That doesn't significantly add to the coalition capabilities there. European powers have very, very limited projection powers in the Pacific, and their limited military resources need to be focused, in the view of America, on their own issues that we might be less willing, able to help them with, and not to help us vis-a-vis China on the military side. On the economic side, the issue is a little different, and of course, Europe does have significant ties with China. But look, I was just in Germany about a month ago, and what I was telling to German government officials I met with is, you should not be looking at de-risking your relationship with China because the United States is asking you to. You should be doing it out of your own self-interest, because what's happening to the German industry, the automotive industry, the most important, arguably, industry in Germany that has gone all in on China over the last couple of decades, is getting decimated, both in China and outside of China, right? Volkswagen lost 70% of its sales in China in the last 3 years. Porsche lost 50%, BMW lost 30%, and that's going to zero because the Chinese cars, Chinese EVs, BYD and others are better, they're cheaper, and people just like them a lot more, both in China and outside of China. So not only is the automotive industry losing its market in China, they're going to lose it everywhere around the world, except maybe in America, because we're not letting the Chinese EVs come here. But the Europeans so far have not put up the protectionist walls in Europe. So Europe is getting flooded by those EVs. So that industry is going to get absolutely decimated. The workers working in those industries are going to lose their jobs. And guess who they're going to vote for? Not the party in power, right? So the political leaders in Germany, and frankly other places as well, but Germany most importantly, out of their own self-preservation, if nothing else, should be thinking about how to risk from China, not do it as a favor to the United States.
Interesting. Because in part two, I want to obviously cover the Russia-Ukraine war as we usually do. And as part of that, Europe has been incredibly disruptive to both Trump's interests, but also Putin's agenda. But when it comes to Europe's capacity to be more strategically autonomous, how well do you think that is going? How possible do you think that is, given Trump's desire to completely ditch Europe in many ways? Or you don't think he wants to ditch Europe completely? He just doesn't want to provide under NATO.
Yeah, he doesn't want to ditch Europe. I think he actually values the relationship that we have with Europe. He hasn't pulled out of NATO. He's convinced himself that, as long as the Europeans step up and as long as they pay up, as he sees it, into NATO, the famous 5% goal, that there's nothing wrong with staying in NATO. Again, that's not the view of some of the more isolationist figures within the Republican Party. It is the Trump's position, President Trump's position, and that's what's most important. But look, when it comes to Ukraine, he's been very clear, not just Ukraine, but really all these conflicts around the world. He wants them to end, right? I think he wants them to end sort of both because he hates wars and thinks that wars are dumb and, people that fight them are suckers and losers. And why can't we just do business deals instead? He also, I think, is very interested in potentially getting a Nobel Peace Prize for all these conflicts that he's trying to end. And that's his overarching motivator for ending the war in Ukraine. How it ends and on what conditions, I don't think he cares much about. He just wants it to end and get credit for ending it. The Europeans obviously have a very different view on that and how it ends and how secure Ukraine is. At the end of that conflict is much more important to them, but I don't think it's particularly important to Donald Trump. And frankly, you could make an argument that it's not that vital to American interests. President Obama, said back in 2014, a post-invasion of Crimea, that Ukraine just matters a lot more to Russia than it does to America. It was sort of a rare, realist description of American interests in that particular part of the world. But it actually continued fairly well under future administrations, and even President Biden, right at the outset of the war, said American troops will not be sent to fight for Ukraine. Ukraine just does not matter that much to American interests. And famously, he said quite the opposite on 5 occasions about Taiwan. So it's a reflection of how American political establishment on both sides of the aisle really see Ukraine.
Sure, but to counter that or offer an alternative, Dmitri, isn't it illustrative that Trump is not succeeding in what he wants to claim he is? Cambodia and Thailand are back at war, or at least border clashing. And while Trump says he wants to end the wars, he's now upping the escalation with Venezuela to the point where we have naval assets of the US encircling and blockading effectively any US sanctioned craft. That not kind of the opposite of what Trump says he wants to do?
Yeah. Well, look, on Thailand, Cambodia, I think he's finding out, and frankly, Russia, Ukraine as well, and Middle East, is that wars are a lot harder to end than it may seem. And there's a lot of history, a lot of entrenched interests on both sides of these conflicts that are not so easy to undo with just business deals and economic incentives. So I think the administration is learning hard lessons there. With regards to Venezuela, we'll see. I think his preference, obviously, is not to go to war, but to get Maduro to flee and have some sort of takeover of Venezuelan oil assets, I guess, that they're saying maybe belong to America somehow and were stolen from us. Not sure about the historical record on that issue, but we'll see if he actually goes to war. He's used, of course, military force once this year with Iran, but that was a one-time bombing strike with no American troops on the ground and really very limited danger to American pilots at that point, because the Iranian air defenses have been pummeled by the Israelis by the point that we came in. Venezuela could be quite different if this is actually a military engagement, not just a bombing strike on Maduro. If we actually put forces on land there, not sure he wants to really do that, but we'll see.
Yeah, and just on the sort of mindset of Trump a little bit more, obviously there's a lot of emphasis that he looks at the world sort of like the 1800s, the sort of Theodore Roosevelt sphere of great power politics versus great power competition, right? These nuances might sound sort of similar to the average viewer, but they are an important distinction. How much do you think he wants to create some kind of, I think The Diplomat, a well-known magazine, called it a great power concert between him, Xi Jinping, and Putin? Is that something that he just looks to the great powers, heads of states, as the way to conduct international relations and grand strategy?
Yeah, I actually don't think that he views the world in the way that we saw them in the 1800s. I think he's actually uniquely different president from any we've had in the past. He sees himself as a businessman, and every relations out there is a business transaction, right? And some are more equal than others. Some are mergers of equal. Some are takeovers. Some are hostile takeovers. But that's essentially how he sees the world. And Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, to some extent, are seen as leaders of strong countries with which you need to deal on a more equal footing, and others much less so, and you can bully around. And Venezuela in particular, that is so in such dire circumstances politically and economically, and that can be easily squeezed by, blockading them or seizing their oil exports. You have an opportunity for a hostile takeover, right, of their oil industry. So I think that's how he really sees the world, and I don't think there's a deep ideological component to any of these issues.
But then what about his approach to, economics? I think that one of the things we've seen about the tariffs is they didn't wield the gross explosion in the markets that we expected, but neither have they greatly benefited America either. It seems to be a bit of a nothing burger, if anything, a slow burner. Do you think that Trump's approach to the geoeconomics of this, as you mentioned with semiconductors and core minerals, could be the difference?
Well, look, again, I have to disagree with you on this. I think the tariffs have accomplished some things. They have risen prices, no question about that. That's pretty clear. But I think the administration is actually right that they're not really contributing to systemic inflation, because by definition, tariffs are a one-time price increase, right? They're not sustaining sort of flywheel of price increases. So even Secretary Besson says, yes, prices have risen, but they're not going to continue to rise because of tariffs, because we're not increasing tariffs continuously, right? It was sort of a one and done mostly type of situation. They have, in the administration's view, they have accomplished some things. President Trump very much focused on revenues, so they have collected more revenues, right? Yes, it's mostly tax on American consumer, but nevertheless, you've had more money coming into the U.S. Treasury. Now we'll see, because much of those revenues are collected under tariffs instituted through the IEEPA statute that is now being contested in the Supreme Court, because that statute actually does not explicitly give the power to the president to levy tariffs. So if that gets overturned, the Treasury may have to do some humongous refunds to everyone that has paid in. So that may not be sustainable. It has adjusted some of the trade deficits that we've had with nations, which is something the administration cares a lot about. You could argue whether that's important or not, but they certainly feel that way. But I think most importantly, from my perspective, I think they have been able to use the tariffs as leverage to get deals, and lots of deals. And even the critics of this administration will point out that the deals are quite a bit in America's favor, whether it's with Japan, whether it's with Korea, whether it's with Europe. There is a rebalancing of the trade system that has been taking place with these countries that has been more geared towards America than it has been in the past. Donald Trump believes that everyone's been screwing us, and we needed to redo all these trade agreements. He did that in the first term with NAFTA and getting USMCA done, which was a deal that was better for America unequivocally than NAFTA was. And now he's doing that through these tariffs. Now, these deals, the critics will say, are not binding. They're not, trade agreements in a sense. They're just, handshakes effectively, and they could be undone. But in many ways, they're probably even more, at least under the Trump administration, more important and more enforceable than an actual legal trade agreement. Because in a legal trade agreement, you sort of set up these dispute mechanisms where you go to court or arbitration to mitigate issues of concern, which can take many, many years, and has, you could argue, because of that time frame, quite limited deterrent effect for parties to not violate them. Here, because you have Donald Trump in office, who will immediately institute, credibly so, high tariffs on a country that violates the agreement, you could argue that they're actually more enforceable than the trade treaties of the past. Now, that may end as soon as he's no longer in office, and another president who would be much less willing to wield the tariff stick as Donald Trump does. But at least for the duration of his term, I think most countries will not violate those agreements for fear of his wrath.
Okay, interesting. No, I certainly agree that tariffs can be an effective tool as part of a broader policy toolkit. And I do think that Europe needs to be more, I don't know if protectionist is the right word, but more defensive of its own strategic interests. I think Europe's been too dependent on US security, Chinese markets, Russian energy, and we're seeing the fallout of that now. But do you not think
the problem is though that Europe doesn't really have many options, right? It's stuck between high energy prices because of reduced reliance on Russian gas, reliance on the Chinese market that is now going away, reliance on the US market, which is becoming more protectionist. So Europe is stuck between a rock and a hard place, and more than ever, I think it is in really, really dire shapes and without great answers for how to move forward.
Interesting. I'm less pessimistic. Maybe that's because I'm rose-tinted European, but I like to think that with a continent the size of half a trillion people, huge GDP, rivaling that of the US, and the capacity to demonstrate innovation, that we can that Europe can collectively move forward. But it is that exact collectivist approach that seems to be the problem, right? When you've got the Hungarys, the different countries that don't want to be dictated by Brussels, there's a problem there. So,
and I have to say, it's not just the fact that you have divisions, political divisions within Europe, but Europe prides itself on calling itself a single market, but it really is not. And anyone who has done business in Europe, and as I have in the technology sphere, can tell you that the way you sell in Europe and the way you sell to America, drastically different, right? If I'm selling a widget in Alabama, the way I sell it in Seattle is absolutely no different. It's the same language, same culture, same go-to-market approach. America truly is a single market. The way I sell in Finland and Spain, oh my God, right? Different cultures, different languages, different approaches, different go-to-market strategies. There is no one Europe. In fact, many American companies tech companies don't succeed in Europe right away because they sort of have this view of, oh, Europe is just like the Europe states of America, where I can establish an office, typically in London because it's English speaking, and boom, I have Europe. And what they realize is, boom, you have the UK. That's it. And if you want Europe, you really have to approach it as 27 different nations for the most part. Or maybe you can have some aggregations in the Nordics or Southern Europe, treating it more as one. But even there, how you sell in Italy, how you sell in Spain, very, very different. So it's not a single market. Those cultural barriers, language barriers, political barriers are still very, very difficult to break down if you are to become the European states like the United States of America.
It's without question that you're not going to see United States of Europe, nor that I would want that. But I'm curious then, as we sort of shift towards the Ukrainian aspect of this, what's your take on the Europeans' approach to the Russian sovereign assets? Do you think it's a good idea? Is it completely crazy? What do you think the fallout would be?
Yeah, look, I think we've discussed this a number of times. I've always thought it was very unlikely that they would move on those assets. A lot of dangers there for the euro and the stability of the European Central Bank. If you set this precedent that you're going to seize sovereign assets, how you would define that without triggering lots of other people coming in and saying, well, this country is also wronged me, why don't we seize their assets as well, is very, very difficult. And you basically, I think, have seen the door more or less close on it this week with Belgium basically refusing to budge. They're, of course, a critical piece of this because Euroclear, where those funds are stored, is in Brussels. So as much as the many European leaders would love to have this this savior, financial savior, if you will, of grabbing the Russian assets to keep financing Ukraine, as opposed to using their own taxpayer base to do so, I don't think it's likely. It's going to be interesting to see what Europe does next, because Ukraine needs money as much as it ever has. This winter is going to be the toughest period of this war since 2022. Increasingly, I think you're seeing divisions within Europe, not just with Hungary, but even with others, of being willing to write checks, being willing to not just supply weapons, but pay the military, the Ukrainian military, pay the government that is not really taking many revenues right now, sustaining the social system in Ukraine at the time when the economic situation in Europe is not going great either.
Yeah. And I guess my last question on that then, before we pivot to the battlefield and Ukraine more specifically, is what about this? Well, I'll come full circle. When we started out talking about the NSS, the NSS described 4 particular nation states in Europe that the Trump administration wants to target: Italy, Hungary, Slovakia, and I think Austria. Right? Is there any value in that, or is it largely what you said earlier on in our conversation?
I don't think so. Again, I've been told that President Macron and President Trump text very, very frequently, right? Have a very good relationship. He has a good relationship with the Finnish president, and others across Europe. I don't think he's picking favorites. He likes Meloni, but he likes lots of these folks. And I don't think he actually spends much of his time thinking deeply about Europe.
All right. Well, on that critical cliffhanger, we'll see you all in part 2, everyone. Cheers. What's your sort of longer term assessment of the Ukrainians' capacity to disrupt Russia's war machine from inside, if that makes sense?
Things are not going well on the Russian side either. And things are getting particularly dire right now with the oil prices dropping. The price of the Urals, the type of oil that Russia sells, is now below $50, which is not a price at which they can really significantly bring money into the Russian budget to pay off for all this military spending.